Hey, we're back with Denis Kitchen here. Hey, Dennis, how's it going?
Hey, Ted. Good.
Dennis has been a real trooper. He's come on here with me for the last 3 weekends to help promote the Kickstarter, and
Bet.
we were just talking about that. We're at about 77% right now, and thank you, Dennis, for coming on. And we're both drinking, which is good. I've got my Irish coffee. He's got his beer.
I've got a switchback ale.
Ooh, that sounds delightful. Is that local?
Yeah, Vermont, close enough.
Oh yeah, that's New Englandish. Is that New England? Yeah, that's New England.
Duh.
I don't know. Anyway,
Don't you Colorado people know your geography?
no, I don't. I think Americans in general don't know their geography.
Such a shame.
It is, but we've got 50 states. When people in Europe only have, I don't know.
Yeah, when I was a kid, there were only 48. It was easier.
Those 48 star flags, though, those were a bitch to sew up. At least everything's all lined up now.
There used to be a song called "There'll Always Be 48 States in the USA."
Oh, yeah, really?
Something. Yeah, I forget the exact.
Do you remember how it goes?
It was 48 stars on the flag or something.
Hmm.
Anyway, we stray from comics.
Yeah. Well,
I just want to say, I love to support small press, and I especially like your small press, and I hope anybody who's listening appreciates, how relatively rare a press like yours is, and it deserves support. And I would hope people would dig deep and help ensure your survival and your growth.
Thank you so much. That's high praise coming from you, and certainly the more I find out about the kitchen sink press and your big history of books. I actually pulled a few books. If we get stuck for something to talk about, which we probably won't, that I'd love to grill you on. But actually, we were talking about, and maybe people don't care about this, but I find it interesting that you just got a cat. You were telling me earlier you've never had a cat.
Again, we stray from comics, but yes,
But that's okay. This is cash.
I was never a pet person, Ted.
No?
When I would draw, well, my first wife had too many cats. That was a problem. She had about 13, so I never wanted to see a cat again. But that was many wives ago, and now my third and final wonderful wife, Stacy, adopted a cat a couple of years ago, a feral cat that was starving.
Oh.
And so Violet named him Tycho, after Tycho Lebray, an astronomer who discovered the Cat's Eye Nebula.
Oh, wow.
He's a cool cat, I have to say. So I'm converted now.
That's good. Oh, I'm glad. But you like dogs too. I mean,
Violet has a little dog too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Good stuff. I wanted to be a dog person when I was growing up, and I love all animals, but we had a really bad experience with a beagle when I was a kid, and that my father ended up having to take the dog to the farm. Back when this was probably I was 11 or something like that.
A common euphemism, right?
Yeah. It was completely untrainable, and it was I think it was inbred quite a bit. That we couldn't do anything with it. But
just like a lot of
a lot of cartoonists.
I didn't say that. Bad joke. Bad joke.
Well, let me pull out some of these books. Actually, I have always been a fan of your work, and I wanted to show the first book that I saw of yours. This is the one. I went and bought this not too long ago because I saw it and I was like, "That's the one. That's the one. That's the first one I saw of your work." And
might mean that I published, not that
published, right?
Yeah.
I don't know if anybody's familiar with how many of you out there watching are familiar with Megaton Man, but it's a really cool book that spoofs spoofs superheroes.
Yeah.
Really, it's based
Yeah.
on a lot of
think,
Marvel people, right?
mostly Marvel, but DC too. Kind of spoofing the Silver Age genre.
And the artwork in it is so
Yeah.
detailed and everything about
Was Don Glassford. He's actually thinking of reviving Megaton Man. So when Tinto expands, you could be the publisher of Megaton Man.
I would. That would be incredible. That would be incredible. And then, of course, I've got. I picked this up last year at
Oh wow!
Time Warp, and this is one of yours. You want to tell us about this cover?
Well, it's embarrassing in retrospect. I was very young. I think the cowboy in the foreground, his upper arm is twice as long as his lower arm. I mean, you exaggerate in comics, but that was an amateur error. But what I remember most about it is the top line says something like America's most wholesome underground comic.
That's right. That's exactly what it says.
It was not S. Clay Wilson.
No. That stuff is. I love S. Clay Wilson stuff, but I definitely this one's starting to tan a little bit. But I love the drawing in that. That's wonderful. Can you dig it? I'm gonna check out the back cover here.
Oh yeah, that's about censorship. That one actually still holds up. It's talking about the war in Vietnam, and it has asterisks where the vowels are in war in Vietnam, basically to make fun of the fact that fuck and pecker and tit have asterisks. So the point was the real obscenity was the war, not the bad words we were using in undergrounds.
That's pretty good stuff.
Yeah.
What did you write most of this stuff, or?
There's one other contributor in that particular issue, but otherwise, yeah, I did my own stuff. The first Moms was a solo book.
I'm gonna try to.
I never was able to do another solo book again because I quickly became a publisher, and that made it hard to stay full time at the drawing board.
How did you come up with the title Mom's Homemade Comics?
It was strictly to set up the subtitle straight from the kitchen to you.
I see. That makes perfect sense, actually. I don't know why you have the luck, the good fortune to have a last name that really lent itself to naming things. You know, the Kitchen Sink Press. How obvious and wonderful is that? I love it.
Yeah, my feeling is if you have a memorable name like that, you capitalize on it. If I had been a Smith, I'm sure the company would have been something totally different.
Right, like Blacksmith Comics or something along those lines. Silversmith, I don't know. That I understand, and that makes perfect sense. You have an interesting first name too. That I don't think a lot of people realize that your first name is spelled Denis as opposed to the extra N. And
yeah, my mother was trying to be different, she said, but I'll tell you a story you might find funny. When I was in junior high school, so I'm about 14 years old in 9th grade, and I'm in health class. So it's already kind of embarrassing because this is where they start teaching about sex and hygiene and stuff, right?
In that order.
And it's taught by the coach, a guy with a crew cut and a no-nonsense kind of teacher. And every week we have these papers and we're passing them forward, and I print my name in the upper right-hand corner. I pass it forward. There's a kid in front of me. I'll never forget his name, Aaron Olander. And without my knowing it, he was taking his pen and changing the D in Dennis to a P. Oh. And because it had one N in Dennis, it was Penis Kitchen.
Oh, my God.
So this happened all semester. And I never got called on, and I started to wonder later if it was because the coach didn't want to call on Penis Kitchen. Of course, he had to know my real name, but when I got my papers back at the end of the year, I was so infuriated. I wanted to kill this kid.
Yeah.
Because
this is the move.
I had never, I guess, been self-aware enough earlier to realize that could be easily changed. So I told my mother, what he did, and I said, "Why did you spell my name with one N on the birth certificate?" And she said, "I was just trying to be different, So it ends up it's the French spelling, which she didn't know.
Huh.
When I'm in Europe, especially in France, they call me Denis.
Denis.
So,
Oh,
yeah.
cool. I had a similar problem with my name. They named me Winston Edward because
They called you what?
I was named Winston Edward in Torsia.
Winston.
Yeah, my father was a big fan of Winston Churchill and the Kennedys, so they named me after Edward Kennedy and after what's his name, Winston, and then my mother cried for a week.
Oh.
She didn't like the name Winston. She said people are going to make fun of him. They're going to say Winston tastes good like a cigarette should, and which is old for most people out there that don't know it. That's an old slogan from Winston cigarettes. There's this great ad I saw not too long ago of the Flintstones selling Winston cigarettes, and
that's right. That's right. They were big pushers.
Oh my God! Yeah, it blew my mind that they were selling it with a cartoon. Anyway, so
now you know why the Neanderthals died out, Ted.
Yeah, exactly. They some people think that that's in the future, actually. That's after post-apocalypse.
Oh,
but I don't know that that's the case. I always thought it was Stone Age. But anyway, so they switched it to Edward Winston, and then they started calling me Ted, like the Kennedy, and from then on it was just constant correction for people that no, my name is not Theodore, and I'm not Eddie. I'm Ted, but I'm Edward.
I think Ted seems like a right name for you.
Thank you. I'll take that.
I like Tinto too. Where'd you come up with Tinto?
Oh, Tinto was what came up on my phone in my office. T in Torcio.
Oh, T in Torcio.
So only 5 characters would come up on the display, this tiny display on my phone with Tinto when I would call somebody, and somebody brought that to my attention and said, "Tinto, that's your name, Tinto." And I was like, "Okay, that's my name." Then when it came time to name the thing, I thought, "Oh, Tinto Press, it's got the tint in it, and it's kind of funny." So that's where I got that from. And then I found out later that Tinto is red wine in Spanish.
So much the better, right?
Even better, yeah. Well, and at first I knew it was red, and I was like, "Oh, it's like the red press, like that's kind of cool." But it actually means red wine, so whatever. But I want to show people this book here. This is one of the when I first met you, you bestowed this book upon me, and it is a collection of. I'm going to see if I can get it up a little closer here. Of these chipboard sketches we talked about last week with Noah a little bit, where you basically you take a Sharpie and you want to tell people about how you got into doing these crazy.
Yeah, I mean, I love that I love the texture of that board. It's like the back of a what do you call a pad?
Paper.
Yeah, and so in the back of meetings, back when I still had kitchen sink press, I would get bored in meetings. I would flip the pad over and start drawing on that paper, and I found that a Sharpie, along with like a basic black ballpoint pen, really soaked into that board in a way that I really like. So all of these are spontaneous. There's no pencils or anything. They're just doodles that just happen. Is that one did I draw on the back cover of that one for you?
Oh yeah, you did. I kind of wanted to show that last. This is a wonderful little drawing he did. Okay. That's an actual chipboard, because this is like a chipboard cover. It's a nice thick piece of chipboard.
That's why I had the back cover left blank, because I figured it would be a perfect drawing surface. So
It's a beautiful book. Did you self-publish this one, or was this?
Sort of. What I did was I subsidized it. At the time, I had my backstock was getting distributed by Boom in Los Angeles,
Right.
and I told them I was thinking of collecting my chipboard drawings, and they said, "Well, we'd love to distribute that too." And I said, "Well, will you publish it?" And after they saw the content, they said, "Well, we don't know how many we're going to sell." So they said, "You pay for the printing, we'll distribute it." So I credited them with being the publisher. Technically, it was self-published, but they still sold over 1,000 copies. And then I sold a few hundred since. It does best when I'm at like a convention and they're sitting on the table. They tend to go because people can actually look at it, pick it up, flip through it.
Sure.
So I've got plenty of. In fact, I'm kind of embarrassed by that collection now because the ones I've done since then are far better.
Oh, okay.
So I want to do a sequel.
Isn't that the way? Well, hey, if you need a publisher for that.
Publisher with quotes around it, like if I pay for the printing or a real.
No, I would pay for it.
We'll talk, Ted.
Yeah, that's it. Absolutely. Nothing like putting on the hook. We're recording this, Dennis.
Take care of this Kickstarter goal first.
Yeah.
Then we'll.
Absolutely. I don't mean to put you on the apologies for that. That was I forgot we were on air here. But here's another book that you wrote and is really, really interesting about a character that I don't think enough young people know about. You know?
Well, I bet they don't, and that's kind of funny because during his career, he was absolutely, without question, the most famous cartoonist in America from roughly the late 30s until the late 70s. For 40 years, I guarantee you, if you asked the average person on the street to name a cartoonist, they would have named Al Cap because he was not just a cartoonist with a very popular strip, but he was on TV. He was on the Johnny Carson show frequently. He had his own TV show several times. He had his own newspaper column. He had his own radio show. He had his own theme park. He's the only cartoonist besides Walt Disney who had his own theme park.
Wow.
This guy was super famous and very rich. And by the end of his career, yes, he also had one leg. So you see he's standing on his real leg in that photo, and he's kicking with his wooden leg. Huh. When he was 9 years old, he lost a leg. Yeah. So anyway, I mean, I don't want to bore any of your listeners who are under, say, 50 or.
I don't think you're boring anybody.
But he fascinated me. When I grew up, he was my favorite cartoonist. Little Abner, which some people may vaguely know was a musical and it was made into a movie. Little Abner was huge. At its height, it was read by about 90 million people daily. It's hard to comprehend now, but that's when newspapers came to every home, and it was a different era. You didn't have the internet, obviously. You don't have the kind of competition comics have now.
Right.
He was huge, huge, and so I was fascinated with him because every day I was addicted to the strip because he was great with cliffhangers. And it was oftentimes topical humor, and he drew really sexy women, and he drew just funny, funny stuff. But also I began to hate him because in the late, there's an example of Daisy May, and actually that was ghosted by his most famous assistant, Frank Frazetta.
Well, okay.
So he was smart enough to hire the best people. He hired Frazetta before Frazetta was famous, although, again, for young people, maybe even Frank Frazetta is not a household word. You tell me.
I don't know
kids,
about household, but it's definitely, if you know anything about illustration, probably.
I got to say, young fans, young comics people, they disappoint me that they seem to have, in general, not a lot of interest in what came before, like the history of comics.
Yeah.
So, to me, it's fascinating, but I find when I go to a place like Mocha or SPX, Not so much Dink. Dink I find a friendlier venue, but in general, young cartoonists and young comics fans have very little interest in what came before what's contemporary.
Yeah, absolutely.
What are we gonna do about that, Ted?
Well, I don't know. I know that anybody that is a student of comics, or a student of comic art or illustration, they've generally, this is something. It's just like music in the sense that, to me, I mean, why would you not want to know about the Beatles?
Well, but I think the Beatles are probably better known, and I think music in general transcends generations.
That's true.
Better than comics have, I think.
That's true, but like amongst those that, everybody listens to music, everybody tries to play music to a certain extent, pretty much everybody, but
Right.
and maybe fewer people pick up a pen or pencil and draw. But if you do pick it up and you become a student of it at all, it's something that you're doing yourself a disservice by not looking into it. I feel bad because I haven't looked into Gasoline Alley as much as I probably should have.
Well,
I just gained an appreciation for Nancy within the last 4 or 5 years. Like, I never thought much of the comic strip Henry, but I kind of want to know more about it now. It's
it's easy to read anyway, right?
yeah, it's real easy to read. And then it's funny how of those strips, especially the comic strips of the newspaper strips, there are ones that stand out like now that have won the test of time. And certainly, I think Al Cap's work is one of those.
Well, yes and no. Yes and no. Last week, anyone who was listening, when Noah was on with me, Noah said he couldn't get past the kind of hillbilly dialect, and I kind of understand that. These days, when everybody's especially politically sensitive, it made fun of Appalachians, and they were white Appalachians. But they were the kind of white mountain folk that you could make fun of because they tended to be uneducated and they didn't have all their teeth. And
I still think
it was just, but you don't do that anymore. But back then it was just considered inherently funny when you talk about mountain people. But what his twist was little Abner and his Mammy and Pappy and his wife and his extended Dog Patch Village.
Yeah.
They were innocent, and they were pure, and they were honest. And so he used that as a foil to have topical humor.
Right.
Because he made it look like they were like the last honest people in America when everyone else was corrupt and dishonest and cynical. And that was the beauty of it. But Noah couldn't get past the dialect, and I understand it.
Yeah. Well, to each his own, obviously, and certain things I know I like better than others. But you've given me a real healthy respect for these guys that I think people. And what's the guy that did Prince Valiant? He's another one that I've grown to.
Al Foster.
Al Foster. Just amazing stuff.
Investment.
Completely appreciated, I think. But we have a question here from Julian Breyer, who was just on. Dennis, your work is full of humor and fast wit, sprinkled with a bit of absurdity. What is your writing process when writing something like My 5 Minutes with God?
Well, I don't know how many people have seen that, but that one was one that was rattling around in my brain for a while. And basically, it's kind of a Shaggy Dog joke with a silly punchline. But the idea is it's sort of self-autobiographical in that it depicts me far more successful than I really am. And I'm throwing wild parties in my mansion, and I'm collecting so many things that I have, even the original Mona Lisa and every jukebox and every Ernie Bushmiller original and so on. Even I collect pubic hair of famous people. And But then a guy visiting the party, a British colonel, at some point says to me, "So Dennis, what's going to happen to all this stuff when you're gone? You know, you can't take it with you." And suddenly, as I'm depicting myself in this strip, I'm like, suddenly for the first time in my life realizing, oh my God, I can't take it all with me. How is that possible? So the rest of the story is me trying to figure out how to take it with me. And the only way I can do that is to meet with God and negotiate with him. So that's the premise.
But that actually hints at a thing about you that is different from, I don't know, every other cartoonist that ever lived, is that you have a sort of a business sense that, and I don't mean that in a greasy way at all. I mean, I think you've got a sense for, you know, like what's readable, what's good, you know, what's going to sell, what's going to make an impact without actually selling your soul. I mean, you pretty much drew all of these other underground comic artists to you in a very sort of organic, natural way that seemed very natural for you anyway.
Well, back then, you got to remember, it's hard for, again, younger comics people to understand in the pre-internet era and the pre-comic book store era.
Mm-hmm.
So there were no comic shops. The only comics were on newsstands. And for my generation, mostly born in the 40s, growing up in the 50s and 60s, the only comics were on newsstands. And we lived through the period as young teenagers when comics got censored, when the Comic Code Authority stamp started appearing in the upper right-hand corner.
Right.
And that was a kind of a traumatizing thing, because I had in my growing collection pre-code comics, and I saw something happen. I didn't understand the politics. I vaguely knew that parents were objecting to some of the content, and some famous psychiatrist was ranting about comics. But nobody ever really explained it to us kids. It just, comics were kind of forbidden in a lot of families. So by the time I got to college age and I got involved in the anti-war movement and all the other movements that were going on then, because about the same time, you know, women rights was an issue, gay rights, the civil rights was still an ongoing issue, legalizing pot, you name it. There were all these issues aside from the Vietnam War. So if you were at all politically sensitive, you couldn't help but get caught up in that. And so for someone my age who wanted to be a cartoonist, you used the form of expression you knew, which was comics. And that's how almost spontaneously around the country, people like Crumb and Spiegelman and Lynch and Williamson and a bunch of us all simultaneously started doing comics that became known as undergrounds, breaking the rules because we didn't want to go work for the man and have our comics censored and give away our copyright and let them keep our original art. So that's when the rebellious part of my generation actually won, because we figured out quickly that there was an audience, all these hippies who were suddenly growing in size, everyone growing long hair, smoking pot. They were interested in comics that spoke to them in a way that other comics didn't.
Right. It was all that, it was just how people talk to each other, basically, right? Between friends. Yeah. But the media wouldn't go near.
So that was the beginning. And I accidentally became a publisher, initially because I self-published, because who's going to publish my stuff? I don't know any publishers, so I self-published. And I did well enough. As a small publisher, you'll appreciate, my first comic, Mom's Number One, I printed 4,000 copies, and I sold almost all of them in my neighborhood in Milwaukee, Wisconsin.
Wow.
Thousands, just to a small section of one city. And because I hustled it and I just had an innate sense of how to market things, other cartoonists started to come to me and they said, well, hey, will you do my comic too? And I very naively said, sure, why not?
Yeah, that's why
And
people get into publishing in general. Sure, why not?
that's how I became a publisher. And it worked out okay, I think, but it meant that from
You
that
think?
moment on, I was never a full-time cartoonist again.
Yeah. Wow.
So,
Uh, that's crazy. We got another question here.
uh,
When dealing with challenges like censorship in the old days and having to create the Comic Book Defense Legal Fund, you know the hurdles comics have had to overtake to get where we are today. What are the challenges of the new generation of cartoonists? Good question.